So tell me, Tim, a little bit about IFJ and why it is has become involved in this battle for Julian Assange's freedom.
The International Federation of Journalists is a membership organisation comprised of journalists, trades unions and associations from all over the world. So we have something like 180 organisations in membership representing 600,000 journalists around the world. And we try to express the will and to represent the interests of all those unions from all around the world. It's been very obvious for some time, looking at motions passed at our congresses, that journalists' unions are deeply worried about the attempted prosecution of Julian Assange. I think certainly from the time that the charges were published, it was clear that these were activities that were the normal work of journalists that the US Department of Justice were pursuing Julian Assange for. And as such, we immediately saw the issue for journalists anywhere. Anybody who was in possession of state documents, of state secrets from the United States would potentially be at risk if Julian Assange's prosecution was successful. So from that time onwards, we have tried to represent the voice of journalists around the world in saying this prosecution, I mean, the extradition should be stopped, the prosecution should be stopped, Julian Assange should be allowed to go about his lawful business and return to the work that he was doing before all of this sort of grotesque circus took off.
How does this strike you, this endless discussion of whether Julian is a journalist or not, sort of in light of the fact that, yes, he is a member of the International Federation of Journalism through his Australian Union, where he has been a member for almost 20 years?
To be honest, I think it's a bit of a distraction, and it's an argument that there's not really very much merit in entering into. There's no question in my mind that the work that he was doing was the work of a journalist, was journalistic work. He'd identified potentially very serious wrongdoing. He found a confidential source who had access to documents telling us more about that, and we're told, helped that source to leak those documents in a very effective way. That is all work that any journalist would carry out to try and obtain such an important story. I understand why some journalists who have trained at university, who've undertaken an apprenticeship, who work within a structure, within a news platform, look at the slightly freewheeling style of Julian Assange and say, well, he's not the same as me, he's not a journalist. And as I say, I think that's a bit of a distraction. I think it's better to focus on what is quite clear, that it was journalistic work, and not get bogged down in what is essentially an arcane argument.
Isn't it the fact that what WikiLeaks presented especially in 2010, 2011, with the explosive leaks at that point, that there was a shift in the journalistic environment, so to speak, basically reflecting the new reality which journalism finds itself into, both financially and technologically. So isn't this as you say, an archaic argument that we need to rethink the entire environment of journalism and the rights and duties of journalists within this environment?
I think that's an important and interesting debate. I mean, one of the things about the news media is that it is, and always has been, a place of very quick and profound change as technology impacts on the way in which we tell stories and the way in which stories become available. And there's no question that the kind of works that WikiLeaks was doing was at the very forefront of that kind of change, both in terms of the scale of the leaks. I mean, there were also profound changes in the way that the US military were recording so much information, far more, I understand, than they had in previous conflicts. So that was a very significant change. Changing also was the means of distributing news. I mean, clearly there was a period, probably when you and I started our careers, Kristin, when the only available news sources were major news platforms, newspapers and television stations. Clearly that isn't the case now. It's possible to it's possible for anybody to publish anything on the web. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that my blog has the same impact as the Times or the Guardian or a national broadcaster, but nonetheless, the nature of journalism and the approach that one needs to take to become a journalist or to do journalistic work has changed profoundly. And, that's something that we do need to talk about. We need to understand how that impacts people's livelihoods and also how that impacts the information that's available to society.
Tell me about the possible impact of the decision that we will hear about on May 20th from the Royal Court of Justice on journalists and journalism.
Well, I suppose there are a number of things that could happen on the 20th. One is that all leave to appeal could be denied, in which case I am guessing in fairly short order, Julian Assange will be taken to the United States. Obviously, there is a slight possibility that his case might be considered by the European Court of Human Rights, but I'm told, and this is not a basis of my own legal understanding, that the chances of that are relatively small. I think if a prosecution starts in the United States, it will be a terrible thing for journalism. It will be a terrible thing for the United States as well. It will show off the worst of the United States. It will show off a country that has a constitution which appears to guarantee certain things like freedom of speech, which, so far as we can tell, may well be denied, one of the world's most prominent exponents of free speech, which I think would be deeply damaging for the United States. But for journalism, the prospect of somebody being prosecuted for finding a source, helping that source to provide information of terrible wrongdoing, and then playing a part in publishing that will be damaging indeed. I think journalists all over the world will feel a shoulder falling on them. And we'll feel a shadow falling on their shoulder. And although there are very many brave and determined journalists, I think there are people who will be handed classified information and will reasonably think if Julian Assange is risking the prospect of the rest of his life in prison, possibly in solitary confinement, possibly scarcely seeing his family and friends again, that's one hell of a risk to take for a story.
You are working closely with journalists from all over the world. Would you agree with me that the case of Julian Assange has even already had a cooling effect and created a precedent that has reflected negatively on journalists and journalism?
I think it's hard to measure whether there has already been a cooling effect, but it's hard to ignore the possibility that has been the case. This has been an enormously high-profile case. It's been reported all over the world. It's been, in court now for more than 2 years. There can't be anybody handling classified information who doesn't know about it, and there can't be anybody who hasn't thought, at least fleetingly, what impact could this case have on me? And the question that I ask is, what don't we know as a result of that cooling effect? What don't we know because people have acted more cautiously than they might have done? We know so much as a result of extraordinary investigative journalism, from cases like thalidomide in this country to the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, revelations about how our societies are organized, sometimes for the benefit of a tiny number of people. They're all the result of really important investigative journalism. And I'm sure there's more out there, but some of it may not be coming to light precisely because people feel worried about using classified information as a result of this trial, as a result of this extradition process.
The Free Assange campaign has stated that this is the most important press freedom case of our time. Would you agree?
Well, it's quite a hard thing to sort of have a league table and to say, well, this is more important than that. Being completely honest with you, the scale of journalists' death in Gaza is a terrible, heartbreaking, and deeply, deeply disturbing case. So I'm not really in the business of saying, one case is more important than another. I can say beyond any shadow of a doubt that the case of Julian Assange is of immense importance. It's of immense importance in terms of the reach of the United States. It's an immense importance in terms of the kind of crazy-headed determination of the American administration to try and chase somebody down. It's of enormous importance because of the almost medieval provisions of the United States judiciary that somebody could face the rest of their life in prisons, which, from the way I've heard them described by insiders, sound absolutely terrible. It's of enormous importance because of the scale and the importance of the revelations on which it's all based. So, this is of seismic importance in my view.
Just to be clear, I totally agree with you that the horrendous sacrifices that the journalists have made in Gaza is simply unacceptable, and that everyone should focus on that as well today to stop the killing of journalists in Gaza. We're all focusing on the court decision in central London. But isn't the case really that to avert this danger inherently in this case, the Biden administration and the Department of Justice should simply drop the case?
The best thing that could happen now is for Joe Biden to come to his senses and simply say, this was a crazy case pursued by some of the ultras in the crazy Trump administration, and we should just drop it. We know that when he was Obama's vice president, he would have been involved in the decision when they considered whether to try and prosecute Julian Assange, and decided very wisely that it was a foolish idea indeed and was a risk to the free press. I hope that that's what President Biden will do. I hope that he will recognize the terrible damage that this case has the potential to inflict on his country and on him personally, and he will simply say, let's call it a day, let's announce that we're not going to continue with these charges and to bring an end to it. There's much else he could do beside, but I think that would be quite a simple step that he could take that would live up to some of the promise that he came into office with.
Many of the members who are working in the sort of mainstream environment in our part of the world, in the Western bubble, do focus a lot about on the fight for the liberation of individuals like Evan Gershkovich, imprisoned in Russia, other imprisoned journalists in outside our sort of Western bubble. They seem sometimes not too interested in the fact that there is essentially no difference between those individuals and Julian Assange rotting away in a London prison. Would you urge journalists in our part of the world to put a focus more on Julian and the importance of his case, just as much as we do fight for the freedom of individuals like Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal?
I would absolutely encourage journalists everywhere in the world, but particularly in Western developed countries, to give this case the kind of attention that it deserves. I think it's undoubtedly a problem that it has gone on for an awful long time, that the events that are the spark for this attempted prosecution are now an awful long time ago. I meet people on demonstrations who weren't alive when the war logs were published. But I think it is critically important that journalists and the media generally take this case seriously and give it the import it deserves. I'm happy to say that over the past 3 or 4 years, I think there has been a steady return of journalistic attention and sympathy. Most of the news platforms with which Julian Assange was working at the time of the war logs being published have now returned to saying that they don't believe that he should be prosecuted, that his work was important, in some cases saying that they believed that they had made an error in diverting course from him in the past. We know that many commentators who one wouldn't expect to be attracted to a cause of this kind, right-wing commentators like Peter Bourne and Andrew Neil in the United Kingdom, have made very clear their views that this is a critically important civil liberties issue, critically important media freedom issue, and that the prosecution should be brought to a swift conclusion by their being dropped.
Let's make those the final words. Thank you so much for your time, Tim.
An absolute pleasure.